All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to everybody here with us in the district auditorium. Welcome to those of you online. We are so excited to have you here for our Dyslexia Parent Night. We're excited to share a number of things with you, information and resources about dyslexia, some updated information about the new legislation that you may have heard about, and we're hoping to clarify. And then also, we're excited to talk to you about the services and supports that your school district offers to students with dyslexia. So first, what we're going to do is we're going to introduce a panel here tonight of incredibly talented and supportive staff members who have joined together to put on this parent night. First, to my right, is Mr. Brett Bonner, Assistant Superintendent of Educational Services for the Sahuarita Unified School District, who's been incredibly supportive to us as we navigate through the new legislation and also work to continually enhance services for students. To my left is Leah Norring from the International International Dyslexia Association, the Arizona chapter, and also next to her is Ms. Jan Spooner, our coordinator for ELL services and also for dyslexia. She is also most of the logistical magic behind tonight's event. Then, moving across the way here is Danielle Pack and Crystal Lewis. They are reading specialists extraordinaire for the district. We've got Josh O'Neill, our wonderful new school psychologist at Walden Grove, and we also have Dr. Sarah Dactyl, who is a speech-language pathologist and also a certified brain injury specialist. Additionally, here tonight we have Ms. Jana Turner, Ms. Adriana Rios, Ms. Kim Snyder, Ms. Jo Passett, and I saw somebody sneak in, Ms. Kate Donahoe, our lovely school psychologist. The 4 previous members are also reading specialists with the district. Oh, I'm Jess Beignet. See when you have your boss sitting to the right of you? I am Jess Beignet, Director of Student Services. I'm very excited to be here tonight and to have this event for you. Questions. Throughout the presentation, hopefully you've been able to grab an index card at the desk. If you haven't, I'll be passing them out. I'll also be collecting them as you write down questions that you'd like for the panel to answer at the end of the presentation. For those of you joining us online, you'll be able to post those questions on the live stream, and we will also work to answer those questions for you. The entire team that we've presented here tonight will be available at the end of the presentation to answer those questions and chat with you a bit. And without further hesitation, we're going to get this party started, and we're going to start with Miss Leah Norring to my left.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. For me, dyslexia is the intersection of my personal and my professional kind of passion projects. In my professional life, I am the executive director for the Amphi Foundation. That means I raise money and I run programs to support the students and staff in the Amphi Public School District in Tucson. In the course of doing that work over the last 7 years, I have become a passionate advocate for public education, and the concepts of access and equity have just gotten closer and closer to my heart. 4 years ago, my youngest son was diagnosed with dyslexia. His name is Lars, and Lars is profoundly dyslexic. He also has dysgraphia, which is a handwriting component. He has dyscalculia, which is kind of the number sense component, and he also has ADHD. And I mention the ADHD because I think that's what presents itself, especially when you are a first grader in a first grade classroom and you're a little boy. I think the natural tendency for a lot of teachers is to say, you know, if I could just get him to sit still and pay attention, I could teach him to read. And what I know now, obviously, is that no amount of sitting still or focusing is going to help our students with dyslexia. So I think it's important to mention that those two things kind of go together. And it's almost like a chicken versus the egg. So when you get the education correct and when you get the curriculum and the methodology correct, our kids can learn to read. He's making tremendous progress, but it has been not always an easy road. So my position on the Arizona branch of the IDA is fairly new. I joined that board in January really just because it felt like the natural next step for me to kind of take my advocacy to a bigger platform. and to start to build that community of people in Pima County and in our part of the state. I'm the only Pima County board member for the state branch, but I feel like we need to build this community of parents, educators, administrators who are also passionate about literacy. I happen to believe that literacy is a social justice issue, and learning to read is a right, not a privilege. So this is a definition that was adopted by the IDA Board of Directors in 2002, so it's been around a long time. I'm not going to read it to you, but I want you to pay attention to the words in green. Dyslexia is neurobiological. This is something in the brain, and what we see from it is problems with word recognition and spelling. People with dyslexia do not see things backwards. They see what we see. And the other thing that I think is really important is this unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. People with dyslexia are oftentimes incredibly bright, and there's a disconnect between someone's cognitive abilities and their, what they see on paper or the words that they are able to read on a page. In learning what I learned about my youngest son, Lars, we've also come to realize that my oldest son, Anders, has stealth dyslexia. So he can read, he gets straight A's, but he has problems with comprehension. And I think it has to do with the way that he was taught to read, using more sight words versus phonics. And so his decoding skills are not probably where they should be. So I meant to bring this book, and then Jan had it for me. Sally Shaywitz is sort of, like the god, the guru of dyslexia. If you don't own this book, and if you want to learn more, I highly recommend it. And I'm going to play an excerpt for you. This is Sally Shaywitz reading just a short excerpt from the first chapter of her book.
And yet distinctly unnatural. It is acquired in childhood, forms an intrinsic part of our existence as civilized beings, and is taken for granted by most of us. The unspoken belief is that if, as a child, you are sufficiently motivated and come from a home in which reading is valued, you will learn to read with ease. But, as with so many other assumptions that appear to make intuitive sense, the assumption that reading comes naturally and easily to all children is simply not true. A substantial number of well-intentioned boys and girls, including very bright ones, experience significant difficulty in learning to read through no fault of their own. This frustrating and persistent problem in learning to read is called dyslexia.
Okay, so there's a couple things about that excerpt that I think are notable. One of them, she mentions that reading is unnatural. Our brains are not actually naturally wired to learn how to read. And if you think about the beginning of civilization, we didn't read as human beings, we didn't read. And so that's sort of a modern invention. And so for 20% of our population, it doesn't come naturally. And I think she also mentioned something about having the best of intentions. Lars grew up, I started reading to him when he was in my belly. His older brothers read to him. He grew up in a bedroom with bookshelves full of books. We read every night. He loves books. But no amount of reading to a child with dyslexia is going to teach them to read. And I did receive that, sort of advice from a lot of my trusted colleagues. Just keep reading to him, he'll get it. And, I knew when he was 4 years old that something was not right. I knew it in my heart, but I couldn't put my finger on it. And the other thing that she mentions is that this is surprising, right? This is not always expected. And I think the more that we learn about dyslexia, the more we realize that it is real. I think Lars got it from me. I'll forward my slide here, and I'll talk about the fact that it's genetic. It was very surprising for us that Lars was diagnosed because I come from a highly educated family. My husband comes from a highly educated family. We're all readers. We read for pleasure. And so the fact that he came along and couldn't read, we were dumbfounded. But now that I know what I know about dyslexia, I see some of myself in him. I see some of my struggles from when I was a kid. I got straight A's and I got a degree in college, but I had to work really, really hard. And so I think, there's some surprise there for some families. I think sometimes you expect it, but other times I think there's some surprise. And it's not necessarily from a parent to a child. So it could be a grandparent or an aunt or uncle. And like I said, the other thing is that it is a spectrum disorder. So we have students who are profoundly dyslexic, like Lars, and then we have other kids, like my oldest son, who are kind of stealth. They fall under the radar, but they've got it. So dyslexia is neurobiological. They're doing scans of individuals' brains with dyslexia, and there are different areas of the brain that are firing in a person with dyslexia than the areas that fire in a typical brain. So this is a neurological issue. The neat thing about our brains is that because of neuroplasticity, all of those connections can be made, but the instruction needs to be explicit, needs to be structured, needs to be multisensory until we can, manually form those pathways. It is also language-based. This is a language processing disorder. And as I said, kids with dyslexia see the letters that we see or the numbers that we see. It's not a vision issue, but they do get words mixed up. Lars mixes up hot and cold. He mixes up fast and slow. So I think that's where that perception comes from, that it might be a vision issue. I also think the vision misconception comes from the fact that students with dyslexia have a hard time copying and transferring words from the board or from a screen onto their piece of paper. So I think sometimes teachers think that this could be a vision issue, or parents think it could be a vision issue. And the last box there is that it's common, 20% of the population. So if you look at, this panel, statistically 2 of us, right? In the crowd, statistically 3 or 4 probably. So in a typical classroom with 25 students, 5 are going to be on the spectrum. You're probably going to have a couple that are super obvious, but you're probably going to have a couple that are stealth, and then you're going to have, everything in between. So thank you so much for having me, and I do have some information about the IDA and, my experience with dyslexia when we're done.
Thank you so much, Leah, and thank you for coming today. Leah and I have only known each other for a couple of weeks, but I feel like we're kind of best friends already because we've been talking so much and we share so many of the same ideas and values about education. So thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to more interactions in the future. And thank you everyone for coming, and for everyone in our live stream, and thank you, Mr. Bonner, for allowing this to happen, because I've been bugging you about dyslexia for about 6 years now. And so as a former reading specialist, I was at SPS when the state finally decided to allow the word dyslexia in legislation. And I remember clearly, I got on my computer, I emailed Mr. Bonner, and I said, dyslexia is in legislation now, so what do we do? And of course, legislation, as I learned as I have learned since then, takes a very, very long time to actually get to the place where it is actually codified in something that can be implemented. And so we're finally there. COVID delayed a few things, but we're finally there where we have direction from the state. So I'm here to talk to you about that direction that the state is giving us. All right, so this is actually from the dyslexia webpage on the Arizona Department of Education. And it starts out clearly stating that we are focused on the importance of teaching children to read. We know that what we have been doing has not been working for all of our students. So now we're looking to implement, and these are words that Leah used as well, systematic and explicit instruction, including following the MTSS process, and I'm going to be talking about that in just a minute. And the legislation is designed to help identify students with characteristics of dyslexia so that they can be supported as they should be. So we're going to talk now about what that identification process looks like. Beginning in the fall, this coming fall, we will be screening every single K through 3 student in our schools 3 times a year. It's going to coincide with benchmark assessment. The screening indicators for K1, you can see listed there. Those are all really good measures for us to look at to determine if a student is demonstrating indicators for dyslexia. And then for grades 2 and 3, they will have an oral reading fluency and a reading comprehension assessment over and above the regular benchmark assessment so that we can help identify those students as well. Oh, also, it's important to note, and I put it in red so I wouldn't forget, and I almost forgot, screening does not diagnose dyslexia. It's really, really important for all of us to understand that this is not a diagnosis of dyslexia because schools cannot diagnose dyslexia. It gives us indicators that a student might have characteristics for dyslexia. And those students who we deem at risk will be receiving further screening so that we can identify exactly where their needs are. All right, so we have some requirements from the legislation, 3 big ones. First one, every K through 3 school has to have at least 1 teacher who has attended an intensive course on reading foundations and dyslexia. And we have done that last winter. Our reading specialists, school psychologists, speech language pathologists attended 6 days of state-approved training. And we're planning on training more. In addition, in our district, through our professional development department, we offer professional development classes on dyslexia to help support teachers in the classroom. The second piece is to decide on an approved universal literacy and dyslexia screener. That's the second part of the legislation, and we fulfilled that with our current vendor who has now been approved to offer the dyslexia screener. So we'll be using iReady as our screener. And then the third piece of the legislation is that we must, I'm going to go back to Leah's words again, we must implement systematic and explicit instruction across all elements of reading following the MTSS model of tiered instruction. So I'm now going to talk about that systematic and explicit instruction and then what MTSS is. So structured literacy, and you'll find this in Leah's information, and you'll find it on the Arizona website for dyslexia and move on when reading. Structured literacy is an approach to teaching reading. It's not a product to buy, it's a methodology for teaching that is grounded in research, it's evidence-based, and we basically have vast amounts of research that tell us that this is the most effective way to teach reading. So if you've ever heard of Samuel Orton of Orton Gillingham, he's well known for his methodology of teaching students with dyslexia. He created this. This is Samuel Orton's work. So let's look at each piece. So we have evidence-based elements. These are the things that we teach. This is the what of what we teach. This is our language, our reading skills here. That is what we teach. And then we have evidence-based teaching principles. This is how we teach it. How do we teach reading? Well, first of all, it has to be diagnostic. We have to know where students are in their skills. We have to be able to identify their deficits so that we can give them the proper instruction so that any gaps are filled. So we have to use data to inform our instruction. Secondly, it has to be systematic and cumulative. We're not doing anything by accident. Everything that we do is intentional. And it follows a progression. We're not picking things out of the air and to decide, I'm going to teach this tomorrow. We follow a clear, established system of instruction and progression. And finally, it has to be explicit. We have to be very intentional in our actual instructional practices. We don't leave anything to chance. We don't assume that students know something. We make sure they know it. And also with that explicit instruction comes a word that Leah used, multisensory. Our teaching has to be multisensory, and that was something that Samuel Orton really shined a light on, was multisensory teaching. So those things combined give us effective reading instruction. We have the dance team from Walden Road practicing. I love those cheers. All right, so I had mentioned multi-tiered systems of support, or MTSS as we call it for short. Multi-tiered systems of support is a framework through which we design our education and determine students' needs in order to give them the instruction that they need. So let's start at the bottom. Tier 1 universal instruction is all students. All students are receiving evidence-based practices in their core reading instruction time in their class. Tier 2 is targeted instruction. So those students who get flagged for possibly indicators of dyslexia, we find out through Diagnostics, we find out what they need for their instruction, filling in those gaps, and then we teach them in a small group setting. We teach them targeted instruction. We use targeted instruction to teach them the skills that they need. If after 8 to 10 weeks, they are not making progress, and we're continuously doing progress monitoring to see how they're doing. If they don't make progress, then they move on to tier 3 instruction, and that is a more intense level of instruction. So those students are not just receiving tier 1, they're not just receiving tier 2, they're also receiving tier 3. So those students who need that more intensive instruction are getting all 3 levels of that instruction. And you can see along the side, it says collaborative problem solving. This is where teachers and teams of teachers come in to work together, to collaborate, to talk about student needs. Yes? Absolutely, 90 minutes a day. So we have 90 minutes a day dedicated in every schedule for reading instruction that addresses all 3 of these tiers. Yes, and sometimes it can be included in that depending on a teacher and their ability to be able to, if they have just a few students, they might be able to also address those needs in the classroom too. Thanks for asking. And the continuous parent communication on the other side there, lots of communication. You're going to find out how your students did on the benchmark, and also if there were flags or indicators of dyslexia, you will find that out too. And then, of course, our partnership with parents is crucial, and I'll be talking more about that next. There we go. Letter 1. So again, this is part of legislation, and this is what we already do with Move On When Reading. The only difference is now we have dyslexia incorporated into those letters. So all K-3 parents or guardians will be receiving a letter following the first initial assessment, and this letter will be explaining laws and procedures that affect all Arizona's K-3 teachers, students, classrooms, and schools. It's going to talk about MTSS that we just talked about. It's going to talk about screening and diagnostic assessment, and it's going to talk about progress monitoring, which is very important. Now, if a student shows indicators for dyslexia, another letter will be sent home, and this letter is going to be very detailed in what was determined in that assessment. In addition, it will give the details of the current reading services that are being provided, and then it's going to offer parental strategies to assist the student in obtaining proficiency. Now, the strategies that are listed are really great. However, if you're not a teacher, the language is quite technical. They use terms like phonemic awareness, phoneme, segmenting, and blending. To a non-educator, that can be really, really confusing. So what we would like to do to support students and to support our parents and families is we would like to, if there's interest, offer classes to parents and guardians showing them what do these terms mean? How can we support our students at home? What are some good instructional practices that we can utilize at home? So we would like to do that if there's interest, because sometimes for some students, they need more than what they can get in a school day. They need to have continued practice. They need to have more exposures of a certain skill. So with that, I would just like a quick show of hands if you would be a parent who would be interested in attending a class. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, and with that, Danielle and Crystal are going to be talking more about that Tier 3 instruction that's right at the top of the MTSS framework. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm Danielle Pack, and this is Crystal Lewis, and we are actually representing all the reading specialists within our district. And in addition to our teaching certificates, we have all gone through additional courses and coursework to obtain our reading endorsements through the Arizona Department of Education. And as Jan was mentioning, many of us have been through several other trainings, but this most recent one was very in-depth and comprehensive, specifically to dyslexia through PDX. In our reading labs, we use a structured literacy approach, and we serve a variety of students that have a variety of needs. We use a variety of assessments and screeners to evaluate what those needs are, and that guides our instruction in that third tier there. It's very specific and targeted to our students and their needs. In our interventions, we have to use repeated, explicit, and systematic interventions to meet those specific needs of our students.
In our reading labs, we use ADE-approved curriculum. Some examples are Hegerty, which is supporting phonological awareness for the early grades. We also use Saxon and 95% group for phonics. In addition, our kindergarten through third grade students, we also use decodable books and passages to help support mastery of those phonics skills in a text. As students start to make growth, we also focus on fluency and comprehension. And our explicit instruction is designed for skill progression. So our interventions target the greatest area of need for our students. When a student is not making progress, we work closely with teachers and with parents to provide support in the classroom, but also at home. And overall, reading specialists work with our staff at schools to make sure that we have strong literacy in the classroom. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Josh O'Neill. I'm a school psychologist, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about dyslexia and specific learning disability and when we might consider special education services. So we've already talked a little bit about dyslexia. I'm going to talk about specific learning disability. So this is a category of disability outlined in IDEA. So that is the special education law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, enacted in the 1970s, updated in the early 2000s. And that states it's a specific learning disability means a disorder in one of the more basic psychological processes involved in understanding or in using language, spoken or written, that may manifest itself in an imperfect ability to listen, think, speak, read, write, spell, or do mathematical calculations. And it can include other conditions such as brain injury, minimal brain dysfunction, dyslexia, which is important, and that one was added in the early 2000s, and developmental aphasia. There's a second condition there, which is mentioned below, and that is that disability cannot be due to, or at least primarily be due to, other factors, which could include visual impairments, hearing impairments, emotional disturbance, or environmental or intellectual disabilities. So let's look a little bit about how they compare. So at this point, we've talked about the definition of dyslexia and specific learning disability. One thing that you may have noticed is that specific learning disability is a bit broad. It's general, and it also includes the language of dyslexia in the law. So you can kind of think of specific learning disability as an umbrella category, because it includes not only disabilities associated with reading, so basic reading skills, reading fluency, reading comprehension, but also other areas as well, including math calculation, math problem solving, oral expression, listening comprehension, and written expression. So when we do evaluations, when we suspect that a child has a disability that requires special education services, we're seeing whether they qualify under the category of specific learning disability. And this is understandably an area of confusion in the schools because we often use the language of special education. Dyslexia is a diagnostic term, and we cannot make that diagnosis in the schools. What we can do are find indicators of dyslexia. We can see whether the students' reading difficulties are consistent with that of dyslexia, but we cannot make that final diagnosis of dyslexia. Okay, so one question you may have is, if my child has dyslexia, why are they not receiving special education services? So it's a really good question. One way to help answer this question is to look at some of the numbers. So the numbers vary on just how many individuals have dyslexia. 20% was mentioned earlier. I have 13 to 15% mentioned disclosed up there. So let's compare those numbers to those of students in special education who are receiving services under the category of specific learning disability for reading difficulties. So that's actually 13.7%. So when we compare those two, we see that there's a big gap between those students that are receiving special education support due to reading difficulties versus the entire population that would have dyslexia. And roughly 3/4, again, according to that statistic, which their estimates vary, about 3/4 will not qualify for special education services. So why is that? It was mentioned earlier, dyslexic students fall on a continuum of need. So not every student with dyslexia will need special education services. We know that with that core reading instruction, all students benefit from evidence-based reading instruction. This is incredibly important when we're trying to determine whether a student has a disability or whether they've just received inadequate reading instruction. We also know that struggling students benefit through MTSS and tiered intervention supports. And many students with dyslexia can have their needs met through MTSS. Additionally, if MTSS, behavior plans, other interventions are not successful, we can also look at a 504 accommodation plan as well. So districts should try interventions to support the need for special education, and data should be used as part of that process. So why is that? And that's because when we're doing evaluations for special education, we're trying to answer two questions. So one is, does the student meet the criteria of a student with a disability? In this case, that relevant disability category would be specific learning disability. Of course, there's other disability categories, autism, orthopedic impairment, intellectual disability. The relevant one here would be specific learning disability. And of course, that's also not to say that someone with autism cannot also have dyslexia. But that second question criteria is just as important, and that is, does the child need special education services? So the evaluation and everything that's taken place prior to that evaluation, so MTSS, the pre-referral process, that's all incredibly important data that is used to support special education services. So the evaluation must show that the student needs special education and that their needs cannot be met through less restrictive means, such as tiered interventions, 504, and so on. And again, with regards to that first criteria, we cannot diagnose dyslexia. We're seeing whether the student meets the criteria under specific learning disability or another relevant category. All right, so as part of that evaluation process, we're looking at a lot of different factors that are going to be relevant. Vision, hearing, how the students respond to MTSS and tiered interventions. We're looking at school attendance outside of evaluations. There's a number of factors that we're looking at to support and to help answer those two questions. So some really important questions specific to a potential reading disability are outlined up there. So one is school attendance. If a child is having difficulty in school and their attendance is poor, it's really hard to determine whether the difficulty is due to them just not receiving the same type of instruction, the same level of instruction as their peers, or whether it's due to a reading disability. So knowing the student's attendance and trying to form interventions to help compensate for that attendance is a really important thing that schools will want to address when evaluating a student. Related to that, school history. So we have a number of students that come in from out of state, other districts, whether they're homeschooled. We don't always know the type of reading instruction that they're coming in with. And so one of the best ways that we have to address those needs, because to be quite candid, we're really not going to know the type of reading instruction for many of those students. One of the best ways is to see how they respond to tiered intervention services. So that's really key for that. Some other factors worth considering is whether the student has a history of trauma or whether there's significant things going on at home. So neither of those disqualify a student from special education, but they are important in helping the team consider what interventions might be helpful for the student. We know that students with trauma or adverse childhood experiences that can impact learning, attention, behavioral difficulties may stem from that, in which case maybe the team might consider a behavioral intervention if that's a key component there. So that just goes to help support what interventions the team, the school might consider before looking at a special education evaluation. So some key takeaways: SLD or specific learning disability does not 100% map onto dyslexia, but of course dyslexia is mentioned in specific learning disability. Schools can use the term dyslexia in the language of dyslexia, but we can't diagnose it. Not every student with dyslexia will need special education. If special education is being considered, schools need to show that their needs cannot be met through less restrictive means, such as MTSS, some of those tiered interventions that we talked about, behavior supports, 504, and so on. And then finally, evaluations look at a number of factors to help rule out or support an eligibility. So for example, if a student has an outside diagnosis of dyslexia, that can be really helpful in answering whether the student has a disability. However, the school would still need to show that the student needs special education support. So it's a really helpful and important piece of data that the team would consider, but we still need to show that they actually need special education support and that their needs cannot be met through other means. Okay, thank you.
There it goes. All right, so now you've heard about supports that are provided by our general education teachers, our reading specialists, and that sometimes our students can receive services through special education if other supports have been shown to not be sufficient. Speech-language pathologists, or SLPs as we're often referred to, are an additional potential support for students with dyslexia. And the graphic here shows our scope of practice with literacy circled there. So why might SLPs provide support for reading? Literacy is considered language in print, and Leah had mentioned before that it is language-based. So SLPs actually support both oral and written language development across a number of domains. And looking at Scarborough's reading rope, this is a well-accepted model of the strands needed to become a skilled reader. The areas that I've starred here are areas that speech-language pathologists are well-trained to support. So starting at the bottom, we can work on decoding, phonological awareness, verbal reasoning, language structure, and vocabulary. It is important to note that speech-language therapy is a special education service in the schools, and if a student is referred for special education services, an SLP would need to provide a comprehensive evaluation, a number of assessments across domains to determine whether the student is eligible for speech-language therapy services. And these assessments can also be used to guide goal development and guide a treatment plan. And after an evaluation, the team then determines what services the student needs and who the most appropriate provider would be. So it could be an SLP, it could also be the reading specialists, it could be special education teachers or other trained professionals such as general education teachers with additional training. And if we are providing services in special education, we need to keep in mind that those services must be individualized to the student's needs. And the team needs to make sure that those services are specialized, unique, and do not duplicate services that another professional is already providing. So for example, if a student has qualified for special education services and they're receiving support through their special education teacher, a speech-language pathologist may not provide that direct intervention because it's already being provided by another provider. However, if there's something unique that a speech-language pathologist could provide, then we would provide that unique service. So SLPs can support literacy in ways other than providing direct therapy. For example, we work to foster language development, both oral and written. We support emergent literacy. We support our teachers and parents through consultation. And we use literacy activities and therapy sessions for all of our students. So working with kids who have articulation impairments, often that can manifest in reading as well. Students who have certain motor impairments like apraxia of speech oftentimes have difficulty with reading. So we're almost always incorporating literacy to a certain extent in therapy with all of our students. All right.
Thank you, Sarah. So just a summary of the things that we have talked about. Dyslexia is neurobiological, language-based, genetic, and common. Screening for dyslexia will begin in the fall of 2022. Students will be supported with structured literacy within an MTSS framework. Schools will communicate with families about student needs and progress. Not all students with indicators of dyslexia qualify for special education. Schools do not diagnose dyslexia. A number of school personnel can provide skilled interventions and supports to teachers and parents, including reading specialists, special education teachers, and speech-language pathologists. And now, Mr. Bonner, would you like the microphone?
Thank you, Ms. Spooner. Dyslexia has had a long systemic history in our classrooms. What's really changed is the legislation, and that's really driven us to provide clarity and how to provide clarity and how to respond to dyslexia. And through the collective efforts of this team here today, you've heard that we've worked closely with understanding the legislation, working with experts who have a deeper understanding of dyslexia, and developing resources and practices to better address students that are working with dyslexia. So as a district, as we move forward and prepare for next year, we do have an ADE-approved screener, which was referenced earlier. It's through iReady Diagnostics. Curriculum Associates is the publisher. In addition to that, all of the panel here did receive training through Arizona Department of Education to meet that compliance factor. And we're continuing to work on our MTSS structure to better serve all students. We've had a long-standing history of developing a reading framework. It is aligned to our MTSS structure, but we are getting better and more improved in that practice. I'm really grateful for the experts, the support, and the dedication, where as a district, we're bringing speech-language pathologists, school psychologists, reading specialists, experts in the field, someone that has a strong history of dyslexia awareness and research and special education together to dialogue and talk to better understand how, as a district, our obligation to better serve our students. So with that, I'm proud of the progress. We still have a lot to do, but we now have systems in place to better respond to the needs of our kids that are working and dealing with dyslexia in our classrooms. So with that, I'll pause. Time for open questions, and we have a panel of experts here that can respond to any inquiries. And if we don't make it in enough time, by any means and all means, please feel free to reach out to any one of us, and we'll be glad to respond to any questions at any given time. Do you want to read it?
Okay. Amber, do we have any questions from you got it? Oh, wonderful, thank you. All right, so my question pertains to what multisensory explicit sequential programs or techniques are used in the classroom for students displaying dyslexia symptoms, but who don't qualify for IEP services. And this is such a great question. Here's what I can tell you. The curriculum that SUSD uses is an approved evidence-based curriculum. So we have our phonics instruction, and which incorporates phonological instruction as well. However, we have recognized just recently that we don't quite feel that our phonological awareness is strong enough. So with that, we have turned to another program, an additional program, I should say, called Hegerty Phonemic Awareness, which several of our teachers started to use and noticed really great results. And so next year, I believe our teachers are going to be having that resource, or some of them are getting it. Next year, a lot will have it. The reason that I say that is because we're doing training on it, and teachers get the book, they get the resource when they attend the training. So I'm not sure yet when everyone will have it, but everyone has access to phonological awareness and phonemic awareness materials to provide supplemental instruction in that regard, because we know that phonemic awareness is a very critical skill for students who have characteristics for dyslexia. So we know that we need to improve that. So we're working on improving that. And so I'll back up just a little bit, because I want to state how important it is for everyone to understand that this way of teaching reading, structured literacy, is very new to many educators. We were not taught this in college. We just weren't. We were taught whole language approaches to teaching reading. So the reason that many of us were so excited when the dyslexia legislation finally came down the pike is because we've been waiting to find out how can we better support this group of students who we know consistently struggle. And now we have it. So as Mr. Bonner said, we're developing all of our approaches, all of our systems right now, and materials and resources to be able to implement with fidelity a structured literacy model in every classroom. It is not going to be perfect. We have work to do, as most school districts do, that are finally starting to adopt this approach to teaching reading. So I would say that our teachers are receiving trainings. They have the ability to take lots of classes through our professional development that help them with their reading instruction. And that instruction is supported by our reading specialists, by our special education teachers, and everyone that you see here. So I hope that answers that question. It's kind of a hard one because we're doing it, but not completely yet because this is all new to us and it requires time and resources, which we're going to be beginning to have. But please know that in our district, 2 years ago, we began a dyslexia awareness training plan for all of our schools. All of our elementary schools have received training on dyslexia awareness. So we're aware, and now we're excited to be able to put in place those things that we know are effective instruction. So for this particular person, I don't want to gloss over your question. If you have concerns, I would say please talk to your classroom teacher, your child's classroom teacher, about any concerns that you have. And then the second part of this question is, what training have regular ed teachers been given to support non-qualifying students but displaying dyslexia tendency? I think I kind of addressed that in the first part, but these are great questions, and I'm going to keep hold of this. I'm going to keep hold of all the questions so that I can make sure that we're addressing all of these things as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Spooner. Next question, what happens after third grade? Is there no support for dyslexic students? Great question. The mandate for legislation is that we're required to screen all students K through third grade with an approved ADE, Arizona Department of Education, screener. I'm proud to say that through a lot of heavy lifting with several members on this panel, we provided the diagnostic, the research support with Curriculum Associates, who is our adopted screener and benchmark provider. We received approval by the state. And so we had to first of all, make sure that we're aligned to state criteria, which we are. In reference to students that are beyond third grade, we've developed an increased focus on professional development for teachers that are beyond just K through third, but all the way up from K-8 all the way up to K-12 in-house. So we're offering more literacy awareness and more staff development focused on how to provide interventions or support systems for students that are struggling readers, dyslexia. In addition to that, all of our teachers that are at the elementary level in their second year teaching experience go through a training in our district called Reading Foundations. That's district-wide, and that's a mandatory training, and that really focuses on the big five of literacy, which is all based on phonics, phonemic awareness, vocabulary, comprehension, fluency. So that's another big component that we've embedded in our district to help support and address students that may have been missed or not caught in that K-3 screening process. Hegerty was mentioned earlier. We're looking at enhancing the curriculum to support phonics instruction, phonemic awareness. We currently use Saxon Phonics. So we'll end up, if the board approves our budget request, that's still pending, but it's in good favor and support, we'll bring Hegerty as a supplemental resource at all of our schools for grades K through 3rd grade. Our reading specialists are utilizing that curriculum currently to help support students district-wide. Another impact for students that are not captured in that K-3 screening process is our development and refinement of the multi-support system, MTSS, that was referenced earlier. Our teachers are trained, our reading specialists are trained, our speech language pathologists, our school psychologists, on ways to then, if there's a concern identified from a classroom teacher, how do we provide intervention support to better support students? So if I am a 5th grade teacher and I have a student that's struggling in reading and did not take the dyslexia screener, I know that I have a resource of teachers that are experts in that field and area. I would then reach out to my reading specialist at my school site, my school psychologist, Jan Spooner, who is our dyslexia liaison, and ask for additional support or guidance. And those resources then can be devoted and then help work with that student and the family to keep them informed. The MTSS provides a layered approach of capturing kids or students that are struggling or that may have been missed in a screening process. So instead of going from automatically to a special education evaluation, the multi-tiered systems approach is looking at students with interventions before you go to an evaluation. What's being done in the classroom, what type of interventions are being made, what type of support systems are provided, what are some of the indications that you're seeing, and that's when that form is done, that process is done, that's when the experts come in to provide that additional support to that classroom teacher. So me as a former 5th grade teacher or a middle school teacher, former middle school teacher, I wouldn't be left alone if I was struggling with trying to find a way to better help my student with literacy skills and understanding. So with that, we also are looking at training all of our teachers at the elementary level next fall on what's coming our way with this legislation. So all of our reading specialists, school psychologists, speech language pathologists, people on this panel are working to create a unified presentation that will go to every school site at the K-8 level to share what is coming our way, what the screener looks like, and what our MTSS will be in place to support the results and how to better serve students that are identified as having dyslexia. So that's another way of outreach to support students in K-3, but also students that are beyond that 3rd grade grade level span. Okay. Other questions?
Okay, so we've got one question here. Why can't schools diagnose dyslexia? It's a great question. So there's 3 parts to that question, or 3 answers to that, rather. So one is that school psychologists cannot do that because we're not trained to do that. So you can think of special education evaluations in terms of us giving an educational diagnosis versus a medical diagnosis. So dyslexia would have to be done by an educational psychologist outside of the schools. So that's one part of that. The second part is that the goal is a little bit different. So in special education, as I mentioned in my presentation, we're seeing whether the student meets the criteria under a disability category outlined in special education law. And so that would be specific learning disability. So to some degree, we can say and we assess for reading difficulties consistent with dyslexia, and we can go straight up to that line. We just can't make that diagnosis. But the third part is that to some degree it's moot because whether it's just reading difficulty, whether it's dyslexia, the end result, what we know works for students with reading difficulties, is the same, and we can help meet those learning needs whether the student has dyslexia or not. But I know as parents that can be frustrating when you want to be able to put a name to it, and so and without that formal diagnosis, for some parents that they may want to seek out an outside diagnosis of dyslexia if that specific learning disability for, say, basic reading skills is not enough. So I hope that answered that question. We have another one of what curriculum is used at Tier 3 for MTSS.
I touched on this a little bit with my response. So one of the, we've already mentioned, was the Hegerty Curriculum, which all reading specialists are using now. And this is a phonological awareness curriculum. It's very systematic and explicit, starting off with rhyming, very simple, manipulating words and sounds. And this is something that we do, at least in my reading lab and most reading labs, the very first 5 or 10 minutes of our group. And already I can see with the students I've been working with, whether they have been diagnosed with dyslexia or not, there's been growth all throughout the students that I work with. So that's the one that Mr. Bonner had also mentioned, that every reading specialist and teacher in the future will have access to that supplemental resource. We also use Saxon Phonics in the classroom. That's the phonics curriculum that teachers use with their students to introduce phonics skills and practice in the classroom. And then for reading specialists, we use an intervention approach, which is the 95% group, which is very systematic again, very explicit. So we are not having students guess anything. Everything we say to them and teach them is very like, this is the letter A, this is the sound it makes, the short vowel sound, and then giving specific examples, giving students lots of time to practice that skill, to identify words that follow different patterns, and then to read it in a text. So those are the pieces of curriculum that we are using in the Tier 3.
Here's a few questions that were texted to me through Amber, so she's getting them online through the live stream. First question, is there a specific iReady screener that will be added to the current iReady diagnostic? Or does the information we get from iReady already have the screener built into it? So they're separate. So all students will do the benchmark testing, and then for grades K-3, let me rewind a little bit. All kindergarten through 8th grade students do our iReady benchmarks for both reading and math. That happens 3 times a year. In addition to that, for grades K through 3rd, there is a printable separate dyslexia screener that will be implemented 3 times a year for grades K through 3 starting next year. Another question online. Hello, Mrs. Alvarez. It's good to hear your voice again. It says here, can the parents who have children already attending Reading Lab attend as well? And I believe she's referencing what Ms. Spooner offered as far as the outreach and parent training workshops for our families and students. And the answer is yes. The more we can inform, the more we can educate, the more we can support. Those doors are open, and so all families are welcome to attend. And we want to make this obviously a partnership and a collaboration. Just so the audience is aware, all of our elementary schools have highly qualified, state-endorsed from Arizona Department of Education reading specialists. So those positions are funded either under Title I, which are federal dollars. So for example, Jana Turner is a reading specialist at Sopri. Her position is funded under Title I grant funds. And another example would be Kim Snyder, who is also a reading specialist at Copper View Elementary School. She's funded her role under Move On When Reading grant funds. So we utilize grant funds to offer a reading specialist at all of our K-8 schools. And then Jill Passett, because she's at a Title I school, is a reading specialist at Cerrito Middle School. So we're looking at continuing to provide those services and resources at all of our K-8 schools. Any other questions? And when Ms. Spooner ends up developing more of the parent outreach workshops, we will definitely communicate using our social media platforms and invites to include and make sure parents are aware when we'll host them, when they're located, and that will be part of our strategic planning for next school year. Right now, as we speak, this panel is working on the presentation for our outreach next fall for all of our staff, so they have a better understanding of what the legislation is, what the criteria is, what the screeners will look like, and how that will be implemented next school year at our schools throughout the district.
All right, this question says, how effective will the screening be for stealth dyslexia since there's a lot of focus on reading ability? Again, we are not necessarily in technical terms of dyslexia, so we have had lots of training, obviously, with the indications of dyslexia, so hopefully I answer this carefully. But with our screeners, obviously what we do as specialists a lot of time is really looking very closely at every single child, especially since we're the Tier 3. So we start at that diagnostic, and of course, if their score is usually showing great need, we will pull them into the reading labs where we have additional screeners that we will use. The 95% screener is very, very helpful because it goes all the way down to vowel teams and all these other things that we can address right away and see where their weaknesses are. So if it's in decoding, then of course that's where we're going to start. Right away, we'll begin working on that weakness. If I think this is referring to comprehension, which then of course we would begin, if we see that the decoding is pretty strong, we will be building further, like Crystal was saying earlier, into building that fluency and that automaticity and becoming more automatic as a reader, which will then free up the mind for comprehension. In addition to that, we will begin working on comprehension strategies and skills. Of course, typically most of those students that are ready for that are more suited for the tier 2 in the classroom where they're getting those comprehension strategies that are already embedded with iReady. So again, I hope that answered the question. Whoever wrote this, if you have additional part of that, if you want to raise your hand, I hope I answered the question correctly.
So this last one is, are SPED teachers up to date on additional dyslexia training? I'm not sure if this one was addressed, Jan, when you spoke.
No, I wasn't, yeah, I didn't reference SPED teachers at all. And yes, I am not sure if SPED teachers have had specific training in dyslexia. However, it's the goal that they will. So if they haven't already, they will be getting it.
And I would say the same applies for a lot of our teachers, K through 5, K through 12. That's why we're organizing this team to create the plan of action of what's coming our way starting next fall. And so we're doing more outreach, more training. And as I referenced earlier, we're offering more than ever before specific trainings in our professional development catalog here in-house on items like phonics, phonemic awareness, reading interventions, reading foundations, to help expand and bring awareness to all professionals that work with students, whether you're a psychologist, reading teacher, or a basic grade level, as I was, a middle school teacher, or a 5th grade, 6th grade teacher. We want to expand the knowledge base so we have a better service model to support our students. Do we have any more questions? Any more questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Ms. Sorche. I think there's a necessity to support all awareness and growth, so that invitation is open. The critical need, obviously, is at that K3, K8 level, but we will definitely extend that invitation for all psychologists, all speech-language pathologists, all reading specialists, and yeah, so that door is wide open. And that's been our model in our district with all of our professional development. It's not just catered or tailored to one subgroup. If you want to learn or become more aware, we open those doors. But because of the critical need, we feel that it's wise that we have the widespread approach to make sure that those specialists that work with students in identifying or working closely on response to interventions or a MTSS, that they're aware and knowledgeable of what's going on. So the answer to your question is yes. Yes, ma'am. In some schools. So in SUSD, because of the funding mechanism, those positions are funded under grants, Title I, which is a federal grant, and then the Move On When Reading grant, which is a state grant. So all of our elementary schools have reading specialists, except our online school is coordinating closely with Jana Turner from SOPRI. She kind of job shares helping our online students. Middle school, the only reading specialist in middle school right now is at a Title I school at Cerrito Middle School. There are no specialists at the middle school level at Wrightson Ridge and or Onza Trail. However, there is a reading specialist present at those schools, so Ms. Rios and also Ms. Lewis, who are at those schools that can provide the support, resources, additional information or training at those school sites. But really the model for Onza, which is a K-8 school, Wrightson Ridge, which is a K-8 school, is targeting grades K through 3rd to be in compliance with that legislation, and we serve the greatest need. So based on the diagnostic data, we rank order students, we provide those services until they show a level of improvement, and then we cycle through. So they might exit, we bring the next lowest student that needs those type of tier 3 supports, and it's ongoing. So it's never just stagnant. We're always trying to revolve students. SMS has a reading specialist funded through Title I monies that works specifically with the lowest readers in grades 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. But as I referenced earlier, Ms. Rios, Ms. Lewis is housed at those K-8 schools to provide that support for middle school teachers as needed. Great question. Any other questions or comments? Yes, ma'am.
Sure, that's a good question. So missing school will impact the learning. We can expect that. However, if it's a medical condition that's taking place over a long period of time, the best approach with that would be to see how they respond through tiered intervention and making sure that they have access to tier 2 and tier 3 intervention supports, seeing how they respond to that, comparing their performance to that of their peers, and then seeing whether there's indicators of dyslexia present from some of the screening and some of the diagnostic information that we have. But to some degree, it will make it difficult if the attendance is not 100%, but we, of course, will work with what we have, and we cannot disqualify a student on attendance 100% if that's a factor. We do need to try to do interventions to address that, and we do the best that we can with that. Did that answer your question? Yeah.
And also, just as reading specialists, from a parent perspective, definitely I would reach out to the teacher or the reading specialist at your site, because we do know once they're out of school, if they're not having that repeated practice, so that's something that you can do at home, and so that way he's still getting those practices every single day. We know that doing something every single day is so meaningful, and we really would want to support you on that. So I would also suggest reaching out to the reading specialist at your site or the teacher and just ask for some activities, because the more, again, that student is practicing every single day, the more gains that he's going to make over time. Yes. Yeah, of course, you have to work with like the teacher and the reading specialist and kind of decide, you know, like what that might look like. But absolutely, I think all of our sites have child study teams where we work together, like you're saying, with several people, where we're saying, okay, this child needs more practice in fluency, or this child needs more practice in phonics. And so they'll be able to help you, support you with those resources.
One more question that I just received through the streaming. My son has a dyslexia diagnosis, but earlier this year we were told the school did not feel he qualified for a 504. Will this be reconsidered under this new plan? My response to that would be reach out to the 504 coordinator. You always have a right as a parent to seek to understand or better seek services or to address concerns that you may have with your child. So every school site has a 504 coordinator. So for example, at Wrightson Ridge, Ms. Lewis is the 504 coordinator. So if you still have pending questions about placement or qualifying criteria or needs, reach out to that person. So I would encourage this parent to go back to that school site, ask for the 504 coordinator, and engage in conversation again to better evaluate the best service model. Any other questions before I hand the mic back to Ms. Spooner? Yes, ma'am. So the question was, is there a list of providers where families or parents can go to for diagnostics, correct? Anybody want to respond to that? Leah?
I can share my experience. I had Lars diagnosed. We worked with a local neuropsychologist who did a full suite of, she evaluated him on everything, including his IQ. It was a full battery of tests. I wouldn't necessarily feel, that was 4 years ago, and I'm not a patient person, so I felt like I needed answers quickly, and we knew I had him evaluated. Lars sees a private tutor, and so his private tutor did evidence-based tool. She did a screening tool on him, so we knew that he had dyslexia. I was looking for the word, and I was also looking for the full picture of, I wanted to know if there was anything else going on. Coming at it from today, I think our schools are in a much better position to actually be looking for dyslexia. I didn't feel that way 4 years ago. So I think the legislation is helping parents to kind of bring that conversation forward, and it's helping teachers to kind of be looking for it too. So I don't necessarily think that I would go the route of an outside evaluation unless I really felt like our school was ignoring what was going on. I think we're just in a better position now. And if I, just from a parent perspective, if I could sort of end this conversation on a positive note, not that I would say that it's a good time to be diagnosed with dyslexia or to come up on a screener. I do feel like we're in a really good position because of this legislation. The state is finally talking about it and finally helping our school districts with providing guidance and resources. I wish that guidance came with money, but that's another conversation for another day. But I think, there's a lot to be optimistic about. And one thing that hasn't really been mentioned is the gifts that come along with a dyslexic brain. These kids are so bright, and they oftentimes are the out-of-the-box thinkers. They're also the kids who are really good at relationships. My son Lars will tell you that his superpower is making friends. So, he's behind in reading, but socially he is soaring, and the reading is coming. So I think, don't let this information be too scary or too intimidating. I think everybody's in a much better position than we were just a few years ago. So.
Just received another question from the stream here. It says, if Saxon is for whole group or tier 1 phonics instruction and 95% group phonics is used for tier 3, is the district looking into a program to use for tier 2 instruction in the classroom? Great question. So as discussed earlier, that Ms. Spooner highlighted the 3 tiers. For grades K3, we utilize Saxon Phonics for all students K3. We're looking at embedding Hegerty as an additional supplemental resource next year to support phonics awareness and teaching. For reading labs, we talked about that earlier, where that's the tier 3 approach. Typically it's above and beyond that 90-minute window. So some students might receive, up to 2 hours or more of reading support a day. In addition to that, for tier 2, all of our teachers are trained in reading foundations on how to deliver tier 2 instruction. So that is more targeted, small group, where instead of tier 1, which is whole group, tier 2 would be more of a small group instruction, where students are identified working on a reading skill and we're implementing reading strategies to help that learner become more proficient in literacy. So the curriculum still mirror Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. It's the delivery and support systems that are being provided on those leveled systems. And I have my reading specialists here that could actually add more if they feel they need to.
Both of those that were mentioned in that question, 95 and Saxon, are both research-based and systematic and spiraled. So I just want to mention that really quickly as well, because they will continue to see those patterns over and over. We know that with dyslexics, a lot of times it's the repeated patterns. And so it's not really necessarily that they're that much different. It's just a different way of delivery. So even with my lab, I do 3 through 5th grade. And like Jan was saying, we do multisyllabic words where we actually have hand movements and lots of gestures that they use with the multisyllabic routines. So again, it's not necessarily that the instruction is, the curriculum, is different. It's how we're delivering the instruction and the needs of the kids who might need to see it more often or deliver it in a different way.
Okay, I'll close out my part by just saying thank you. I'm going to hand the mic over to Ms. Spooner for closing remarks. And I really appreciate you being here this evening. Again, the legislation has provided clarity on what we need to do as a district, but we are committed to go beyond just legislation. We want to work at keeping parents informed, providing resources where you're better equipped to deliver support to your children. In addition to that, all of us at this panel are committed to better serving our students and your children. At any time, if you have questions about programs, services, reach out to me, reach out to anyone at your school site. We have 504 coordinators at every site. We have reading specialists at the sites I referenced earlier. We have school psychologists throughout the district. We have a lot of experts that are willing to respond to your questions and to keep you informed and to help provide guidance to better support the students we serve. So again, thank you for being here, and I'll pass it over to Ms. Spooner.
Thank you. I just wanted to say thank you so much for coming. Thank you for this fabulous team and your passion and your support of this endeavor. We're hugely excited about the legislation. Now the gates have been opened, and so we can now set forth on this path from going from flying a Cessna to flying a 747. Which is really what we are elevating our practices to a very high degree. And this is a work in progress. We're at the very beginning stages of this in many ways. And so, but what is so powerful is our connection with families. And we need to be in partnership with you and support one another. If you have a child that is not reading, we need to find out why, because we want every single child to be able to read. If you have any questions at all, please don't hesitate to contact any of us. Call me. I could talk about dyslexia all day long, and I often do. And so I welcome and invite your emails, jspooner@sarita.net. Give me a call. I'm at the district office. Really and truly, this is our mission. It is to support reading instruction in this district so that every child can read. Thank you so much. Also, Leah has information here from the Arizona branch of the International Dyslexia Association, and we have brochures here from the Arizona Department of Education on dyslexia.